"Leave the papers," Martha shouted over the roar of water. Ethan had the metal case in his hands, the one thing that could prove his father hadn't been a fool. Ranger barked from the ridge, soaked, frantic, pointing toward the only safe path. Below them, Sparrow Wash was no longer dry. It was moving, red and loud, swallowing the road piece by piece. "Ethan, please," Owen called. Ethan looked at the case. 55 years of truth. One chance to save it. Then Ranger barked again, and Ethan finally understood what his father had really left him. What would you do if the only thing your father left you was a grave made of rusted steel? Not a house with a porch light still glowing. Not a little savings account tucked away for hard days. Not even a patch of good Arizona dirt where something green might still have the nerve to grow. For Ethan Cole, 42 years old, former Army combat engineer, and a man who had spent most of his adult life learning how to measure damage without letting anyone see his own, the answer came folded inside a yellow county envelope, creased down the middle like it had been waiting too long to be opened. He stood outside the Dry Creek Falls courthouse with the paper in one hand and Ranger's leash in the other, while the late summer sun pressed down on the town so hard the sidewalks seemed to shimmer. Ranger, his 7-year-old German shepherd, sat at his left boot, ears high, amber eyes watching the courthouse doors as if they might open and explain everything. They did not. Nothing in Dry Creek Falls explained itself. The town had always preferred silence, gossip, and dust. Ethan had come back 3 days earlier for his father's funeral, though funeral felt too generous a word for what it had been. A few folding chairs beneath the chapel fan, 2 old railroad men in clean shirts, a minister who had known Walter Cole only by reputation and spoke of him with the careful kindness people reserve for men they never fully understood. Walter had been called stubborn, strange, hard to read. A decent man, folks said, but always chasing something no one else could see. Ethan had stood beside the casket in his dark suit, feeling the shameful arithmetic of absence adding itself up inside him. Missed calls, unanswered letters, holidays postponed, visits promised and not taken. Ranger had leaned against his leg through the whole service, steady as a handrail. Now all that remained of Walter Cole's life fit into 2 boxes in the bed of Ethan's pickup, a dented toolbox. A coffee tin of receipts, 3 work shirts smelling faintly of cedar and machine oil, and the deed. The deed was the part nobody knew how to say gently. Sparrow Wash, the legal description read, 38 acres of dry ravine and rock shelf east of town, including all abandoned rail material, structural remnants, and the derelict freight car commonly known as the Red Spike. Ethan had heard the name before, everyone had. The Red Spike was not a landmark so much as a warning. A rusted boxcar from the 1969 Southern Rim derailment still jammed nose down in a red rock wash where the old spur line had failed before it ever had a chance to matter. It had outlived the railroad company, the investors, the surveyors, and most of the men who had sworn the line would bring prosperity to the valley. 55 years of sun had peeled its paint into scabs. Wind had packed its seams with dust. Generations had turned it into a joke, then a ghost story, then something uglier than both. Proof, people liked to say, that some dreams deserved to stay buried. And Walter Cole, with his bad knees, small pension and refrigerator full of discount groceries, had kept paying taxes on it. Ethan looked down at the deed again, reading the words until they blurred. Ranger shifted beside him, not restless, not impatient, just alert in that quiet, unnerving way he had when some part of the world did not sit right. Across Main Street, under the striped awning of the Mesa Diner, 2 men paused over their coffee and looked Ethan's way. One of them lifted his chin toward the envelope. The other gave a soft laugh Ethan could not hear, but somehow felt. Dry Creek Falls was good at that, turning a man into a story before he had time to speak for himself. The town sat in a basin of heat and old disappointments. Its water tower faded, its storefront windows filmed with dust, its hope measured in inches of rain that never came. Ethan had left at 19 because the place felt too small for his lungs. He had spent years building roads through broken terrain, reading soil, drainage, stress lines, load paths. He knew how to look at a cracked bridge and hear the math of collapse. But standing there with his father's last gift in his hand, he could not read a thing. Only one thought kept circling him, slow and sharp. Why would you leave me a wreck? A dry wind moved along the street, lifting grit around his boots. Ranger rose suddenly. His nose pointed east, past the courthouse, past the feed store, toward the empty road that led out to Sparrow Wash. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. There was nothing there but heat, distance, and the pale suggestion of red hills trembling beyond the town. Still, Ranger stared as if something out there had called his name. Ethan folded the deed carefully, almost respectfully now, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "All right," he murmured, though he was not sure whether he was speaking to the dog, his father, or the part of himself that had almost walked away. "We'll go see what you were holding on to." Ranger gave one low breath, not quite a whine, not quite a sigh, and stepped toward the truck. Behind them, Dry Creek Falls kept watching. Ahead of them, somewhere in a forgotten ravine, a rusted boxcar waited like a question no one had bothered to ask for 55 years. Ethan Cole had learned early that some men came home all at once, with open arms and easy laughter, while others returned in pieces so small even they could not name what was missing. He was 42, broad across the shoulders, but lean from years of carrying weight no one could see. With close-cut brown hair threaded faintly with gray near the temples, and eyes the color of rain before it falls. People in Dry Creek Falls remembered him as Walter Cole's quiet boy, the one who could fix a bicycle chain by 12 and take apart a radio by 14 just to see how the voices got inside. But the man who had stepped back into town was not that boy. Ethan moved carefully, as if every room had a weak floorboard. He listened before answering. He noticed exits without meaning to. He studied people the same way he studied old bridges, looking for stress, fatigue, the places where something might give way. In the Army, he had been a combat engineer, though he rarely used the full title. He preferred to say he worked with roads, water lines, drainage, and broken ground. That sounded simpler. Cleaner. He had spent years reading landscapes for danger and possibility, learning how soil shifted, how pressure traveled, how a small crack could become a collapse if ignored long enough. It was useful work, honest work, work that made sense because concrete never lied and rivers always followed gravity. People were harder. Fathers were hardest of all. Walter Cole had not been an affectionate man, not in the obvious ways. He did not say, "I miss you" on the phone. He said, "Your truck's still making that noise?" He did not ask Ethan to come home for holidays. He said, "The east fence needs 2 hands if you're passing through." For years, Ethan mistook that for distance. Maybe it was. Maybe it was just the only language Walter knew. Now, in the stale quiet of the old house, Ethan found evidence of care everywhere, and each piece hurt worse than a goodbye. His favorite coffee brand, still unopened in the pantry. A stack of newspaper clippings about veterans' job programs. A photograph of Ranger sleeping under Walter's kitchen table, dated the winter Ethan was working in Nevada and too tired to call. Ranger had belonged to Ethan first, a retired search-and-rescue German shepherd with a dark saddle coat, a graying muzzle, and a dignity that made strangers lower their voices. But for the last 2 years, while Ethan drifted from contract to contract, Ranger had stayed with Walter. The arrangement had been temporary, then comfortable, then quietly permanent in the way lonely men avoid admitting they need company. Walter and Ranger had become their own small household. One old railroad man, one watchful dog, 2 silences that understood each other. That evening, Ethan sat on the back steps with the deed beside him and Ranger at his feet. The yard was dry, the grass gone silver and brittle, the air smelling of creosote, dust, and distant asphalt cooling after a brutal day. From somewhere downtown came the thin sound of a screen door slapping shut. Ethan rested one hand on Ranger's neck, feeling the slow, steady warmth beneath the fur. "He knew something, didn't he?" he asked. Ranger did not look up. He only breathed out and leaned heavier against Ethan's boot, as if answering in the only language that had ever mattered in the Cole family: presence. For the first time since the funeral, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not peace, not yet, but a small, stubborn pull toward the truth his father had left behind. By morning, Dry Creek Falls had done what small towns do best. It had taken a private sorrow, dressed it in rumor, and walked it down Main Street before breakfast. Ethan felt it the moment he stepped into the county records office, Ranger waiting outside beneath the thin shade of a mesquite tree. The room smelled of old paper, floor wax, and air conditioning that had given up around July. Behind the counter, Martha Bell adjusted her glasses and studied the deed as if it might sprout wings. She was in her late 60s, silver-haired, straight-backed, with the patient expression of a woman who had spent 40 years watching men argue with documents they had not bothered to read. "Sparrow Wash," she said finally. Her voice softened on the name, not with affection, but with recognition. "I haven't seen this parcel come across my desk in years." Ethan stood with his hands loosely clasped, though every part of him wanted something solid to hold. "My father kept it current?" Martha tapped the paper with one careful fingernail. "Every year, sometimes late, never unpaid. Last spring he cleared the remaining fees. Just under $3,000, all told." That number landed harder than Ethan expected. $3,000 was not fortune money, not to some people. But Walter had stretched grocery money, patched his own roof, and driven a truck old enough to vote. $3,000 meant intention, sacrifice. A choice made quietly enough for everyone to miss. Before Ethan could ask another question, the office door opened and let in a square of white heat. A man in pressed jeans and a pale linen shirt stepped inside, carrying the scent of expensive cologne and sun-baked leather. Grant Harlan. Ethan knew the name before he remembered the face. Every town had one. The man who bought tired land from tired people and called it vision. Grant smiled as if they had already agreed on something. "Ethan Cole," he said, extending a hand. "Sorry about Walter. He was a decent old man." The words were polished smooth, but there was no weight behind them. Ethan shook his hand once and let go. "Thank you." Grant glanced at the deed on the counter, then gave a low whistle. "So it's true. He left you the red spike." Martha's mouth tightened. Grant did not notice or pretended not to. "Listen, I'll be honest with you. That wash is a liability. Bad access, no water rights on record, rusted rail debris, unstable slopes. Your father had a sentimental streak. Nothing wrong with that, but sentiment can get expensive." Ethan felt the old habit rise in him. Say little, reveal less. "You interested in buying it?" Grant's smile widened. "I'll give you $10,000, cash closing. You can settle up funeral costs, walk away clean, and let someone else deal with the mess." Outside, Ranger stood. Through the window, Ethan saw the dog's ears angle forward, his body still as carved stone. Grant followed Ethan's glance and chuckled. "Dog doesn't like me? He's selective," Ethan said. Grant looked back at the deed. "Don't make your father's mistake. Walter spent years guarding a rusted boxcar like it was the Ark of the Covenant. Folks admired his work ethic. Sure, but a man can be hard-working and wrong at the same time. There it was. Not an insult loud enough to challenge. Worse, a dismissal wrapped in reason. Ethan pictured Walter at the kitchen table, counting bills, choosing taxes over comfort, preserving something nobody else valued. He folded the deed slowly and slipped it into his pocket. "I'll look at the land first." Grant's expression barely changed, but something behind his eyes cooled. "Of course. Just don't wait too long. Desert eats things faster than people think." When Ethan stepped outside, Ranger came to his side without command. Across the street, two men outside the diner had stopped pretending not to watch. Ethan did not look away this time. He laid a hand on Ranger's head and felt the dog's steady warmth under his palm. For the first time, the deed no longer felt like a joke. It felt like a test. Ethan waited until the sun had slipped just far enough west to stop turning the windshield into a white sheet of fire. Then he drove out of Dry Creek Falls with Ranger riding in the passenger seat, like a sheriff who had seen too many towns disappoint themselves. The road east narrowed after the last gas station, losing its painted lines first, then its shoulder, then any pretense of being cared for. Mesquite and brittle grass leaned away from the heat. Fence posts stood crooked in the dust. In the distance, the red hills rose low and worn, not dramatic enough for postcards, but old enough to make a man feel temporary. Ethan drove with the deed on the dashboard and one hand loose on the wheel. He had meant to come only to look, to satisfy whatever duty remained between a son and a dead father. But the farther he got from town, the quieter Grant Harlan's voice became. Out here, there were no diner windows, no polite smirks, no easy words like worthless. There was only land, dry and patient, holding its breath under the late summer sky. Ranger lifted his nose to the cracked window before the wash came into view. His ears rose, and a thin line of tension moved through his back. Ethan slowed. "You smell something?" Ranger did not turn. He stared ahead. Sparrow Wash opened suddenly below a shelf of sandstone. A scar of pale clay and red rock cut through the desert floor. At first Ethan saw only emptiness, a dry channel, a few rusted rail ties, the broken ribs of an old trestle half buried in sand. Then the sun caught on metal, and the red spike appeared. It was larger than memory had made it. A freight box car, once painted deep southern rim red, now stripped by 55 years of heat into patches of rust, faded lettering, and raw steel. It sat nose down in the wash at a hard angle, its front end driven into the earth as if the ground itself had swallowed it mid-sentence. The rear doors hung twisted but closed. The roof had buckled inward. Old graffiti crawled along one side, some of it recent, most of it weathered into meaningless stains. Ethan parked near the old service road and stepped out. Heat came up through his boots. The air smelled of dust, sun-baked iron, and dry creosote. Ranger jumped down without waiting for a command and stood perfectly still, studying the wreck with the grave attention he usually reserved for unstable structures. Ethan felt something tighten behind his ribs. He had expected a joke, a relic, a sad little monument to one more Cole family mistake. But standing before the red spike, he felt the strange dignity of a thing that had endured being misunderstood. He walked the wash slowly, measuring without meaning to. The old rail bed was still visible along the ridge, though erosion had eaten much of it away. The drop from the spur line to the boxcar's resting place should have sent the car eastward, maybe rolling once before settling against the lower rocks. But it had not. It had speared downward and south, too steep, too clean, as if the earth beneath it had given way after the fall. Ethan crouched and pressed his palm against the clay near the buried nose. The soil was harder there, packed tight, not just by time but by pressure from below. "That's wrong," he murmured. Ranger was already moving. The shepherd circled the front of the car, nose low, paws careful among the shards of stone. He ignored a lizard flicking under a bush, ignored the sun-bleached bottle caps, ignored every ordinary smell a dog might chase. He stopped beside a slab of sandstone, half covered by tumbleweed, and scraped once at the dirt. Then again, not frantic, not playful, purposeful. Ethan joined him, brushing away dust with his gloved hand. At first he saw only rust-colored earth. Then a straight edge appeared. Metal, not rail, not scrap. A fitted plate, set flush against the side of the buried boxcar, protected from sight by decades of wash and wind. Ethan cleared more dirt until faint letters emerged beneath his thumb, shallow but unmistakable. Survey Compartment B. The words sat there in the fading light, small enough to be missed by anyone passing through, plain enough to rearrange the entire world. Ethan sat back on his heels. His heartbeat had gone quiet and heavy. A freight car was one thing, a survey compartment was another. Ranger looked at him, amber eyes steady, dust on his muzzle like gray powder. For a moment, Ethan could almost see Walter standing there years earlier, old hands on old knees, staring at the same plate and refusing to let the town laugh him out of what he had found. The wind moved through the wash, slipping under the rusted car with a low, hollow note. It sounded less like decay now, and more like a locked door waiting for the right hand. Ethan touched the words once more, then looked toward the road back to Dry Creek Falls. He had come to inspect a burden. He had found a question with his father's fingerprints all over it. Ethan returned to Sparrow Wash the next morning before the heat had fully risen, though the desert was already awake in its quiet, unforgiving way. Light spilled over the red hills, thin and gold at first, then sharper, finding every broken rail tie, every strip of peeling steel, every old wound in the land. He came prepared this time. Measuring tape, survey flags, a camera, a field notebook, a pry bar he did not yet use, and Walter's dented toolbox riding in the truck bed like an old witness called back to testify. Ranger jumped down first, gave the wash a slow inspection, then trotted toward the buried nose of the red spike, as if he had been assigned that post years ago, and had never been relieved. Ethan worked without hurry. That was something the army had taught him, and grief had nearly made him forget. Panic wasted strength. He photographed the angle of the boxcar. He marked the ridge where the original spur line had run. He studied the slope, the wash pattern, the hard-packed clay around the buried end. By noon, sweat had darkened the back of his shirt, and dust had settled into the creases of his hands, but the picture forming in his mind was stranger than before. The car had not simply fallen. It had dropped into a weakness below the surface, a hidden pocket or collapsed channel that had swallowed its weight. "You didn't land here by accident," he said softly, touching the rusted side of the car. Ranger, lying in the sliver of shade beneath the frame, opened one eye as if to say he had known that from the beginning. Over the next several days, Ethan built a routine around the wreck. Morning in the wash, afternoon in the county library, evening at Walter's kitchen table, where the old ceiling fan clicked overhead and Ranger slept with his muzzle on Ethan's boot. At the library, he found brittle newspaper articles about the 1969 Southern Rim derailment, all written with the clipped certainty of men who wanted the story finished quickly. Mechanical failure, unstable ground, project abandoned, investors withdrew. No further inquiry recommended. The articles mentioned freight, construction materials, and survey equipment, but only once did a name appear that made Ethan sit straighter. Marrow and Pike Survey Company. He copied it into his notebook and underlined it twice. That night, while searching through Walter's toolbox for a smaller brush, Ethan found a false bottom under a tray of rusted sockets. Beneath it lay a pocket notebook wrapped in an oilcloth rag. Walter's handwriting filled the pages, cramped and slanted, each note dated over the span of years. Watermarks on south wall, hollow sound beneath plate. Old survey car, not freight only. Vance, M&P, Ask County, records missing. Ethan turned the pages slowly, feeling his father's mind come alive in fragments. Then he found the line that stopped him cold. The car didn't fall into nothing. It fell into the answer. For a long while, Ethan did not move. The house around him seemed to hold its breath. All those years, Walter had not been guarding rust. He had been guarding a question no one respected enough to ask. The next morning, Ethan went back to Sparrow Wash with a different kind of tenderness. He brushed dust from the words Survey Compartment B with the care of a man cleaning a name from a headstone. Ranger stood close, nose working along the seam of the plate, then gave 2 short barks and pawed at a narrow vent nearly hidden beneath a crust of clay. Ethan cleared it and felt a faint breath of cool air rise from inside the buried compartment. Not much, just enough. Enough to prove there was space beyond the steel. Enough to prove Walter had been right to wonder. Ethan sat back, heart steady but full, and looked across the silent wash toward town. Dry Creek Falls had laughed at his father because laughter was easier than listening. But out here, beneath iron, dust, and 55 years of heat, the land had been keeping its own record. And for the first time since coming home, Ethan felt less like a man sorting through what was left behind, and more like a son being invited. Finally, into the conversation his father had been trying to start. By the end of the week, Sparrow Wash had stopped being a place Ethan visited and become a place that followed him home. Dust from it lived in the cuffs of his jeans. The metallic smell of the red spike clung to his hands even after washing. Walter's notebook sat open on the kitchen table every night, its pages weighted by a coffee mug, as if the old man might return and keep writing where he had left off. Ethan tried to move carefully through the evidence, but the town moved faster through rumor. Someone had seen him measuring the wreck. Someone else claimed he was planning to sue the county. By Friday morning, Mesa Diner had turned Walter Cole's private notes into public entertainment without ever having read a word. Ethan heard his father's name as soon as he stepped inside. Not loud. That would have been easier. It came in that softer tone people use when they want kindness to disguise contempt. Poor Walter, a man at the counter said, spent half his pension chasing a boxcar. Another answered, now the son's out there doing the same thing. Ethan paused by the door. Ranger stood beside him, calm but alert, the tags on his collar giving one quiet click. The room noticed the dog before it noticed Ethan's face. Conversations thinned, then stopped. Ethan ordered coffee to go. He did not defend Walter. He had learned long ago that some rooms were not built for truth, only for echoes. Outside, Grant Harlan leaned against a white pickup, polished too clean for the county roads. He held a paper cup in one hand and Ethan's future, or what he thought was Ethan's future, in the other. You are a hard man to catch, Grant said. I've been meaning to improve my luck. Ethan took his coffee from the waitress through the takeout window and kept walking. Grant fell into step beside him. I'll make this simple. $25,000, clean offer. I handle filings, disposal, liability, all of it. The number landed with a quiet, dangerous mercy. $25,000 would cover the funeral balance. It would fix the pickup's transmission. It would give Ethan enough to leave Dry Creek Falls before the town finished turning him into Walter's sequel. For 1 weak second, he saw it. A signed paper, an empty road, Ranger asleep on the seat beside him, No more rust, no more whispered pity, no more trying to understand a dead man who had never made himself easy to understand alive. Grant saw the hesitation and softened his voice. There's no shame in letting go. Your father was a good man, but good men get attached to useless things. You don't have to inherit the attachment. Ethan looked toward the east, where the red hills shimmered beyond the rooftops. And what do you want with useless land? Grant smiled just enough. Solar staging, equipment storage, maybe a private access road down the line. Nothing sentimental. Ranger gave a low sound in his chest, not a growl exactly, more like distant thunder remembering itself. Grant glanced down and stepped half a pace away. Ethan noticed. That afternoon the county safety notice arrived. Not a violation yet, but close. Unstable debris. Unauthorized structural inspection. Potential public hazard. Martha Bell called him personally, her voice lower than usual. Ethan, I'm not saying this to scare you, but if the county board gets pushed, they can restrict access. And Grant knows how to push. For the first time, anger did not come, only exhaustion. Ethan drove to Sparrow Wash near sunset and stood before the red spike while the whole desert turned copper around him. The hidden plate waited under its veil of dust. Walter's words waited in his pocket. Ranger climbed into the shade beneath the boxcar and lay down beside the narrow vent he had found, refusing the open truck door, refusing the road home. Ethan almost laughed, but it came out broken. Maybe they're right, boy, he said. Maybe we're just two fools guarding a hole in the ground. Ranger lifted his head. His ears did not flatten. His eyes did not soften with pity. He simply looked at Ethan the way he had looked at collapsed walls, washed-out roads, and every hard place they had ever crossed together, as if waiting for the man to finish doubting and start working. Ethan stood there until the last light left the ridge. Then he opened Walter's toolbox, took out the permit forms Martha had given him, and signed his name on the hood of the truck. Not because he was certain. Certainty was a luxury. He signed because respect sometimes began as a decision made before the proof arrived. The permit came through on a Tuesday morning with 3 signatures, 2 warnings, and a paragraph of language that seemed designed to make permission feel like a dare. Ethan read it twice at the kitchen table while Ranger watched from the doorway, head tilted, as if bureaucracy were a scent he did not trust. By noon they were back at Sparrow Wash. The sky was pale and merciless, a hard bowl of light over the red hills. Heat wavered above the truck hood. Cicadas screamed from the mesquite brush, their dry electric song rising and falling like a warning system no one had installed. Ethan set out his tools in a careful row beside Walter's old toolbox. Brush, socket wrench, pry bar, flashlight, camera, gloves, evidence bags Martha had insisted he use, and a canteen already sweating through its canvas sleeve. He moved slowly. Not because the work was difficult, though it was, but because part of him feared what opening the compartment might do. As long as the plate stayed sealed, Walter could still be right in theory. Once opened, the truth would have edges. It might bless him. It might embarrass him. It might prove the town had laughed for good reason. Ranger stood beside the buried nose of the boxcar, still as a sentinel, dust clinging to the gray around his muzzle. Ethan knelt at the plate and cleared the seam with a stiff brush. Each stroke lifted 55 years of grit. The words "Survey Compartment B" emerged darker now, cut into steel with a purpose that did not feel accidental. The first bolt resisted. The second turned with a shriek that made the wash seem to flinch. Ethan worked patiently, sweat running down his neck, his hands steady even when his chest was not. When the last bolt came free, the plate did not fall open. It held. Ranger stepped closer and nosed the lower edge. Ethan slid the pry bar in gently, leaned his weight, and the seal broke with a tired metal sigh. Cool air breathed out from the darkness. Not much, just enough to touch his face like a hand from underground. Ethan froze. For a moment he was no longer 42. He was 12 again, standing beside Walter in the garage, watching his father open an old radio and whisper, "Never force what's been waiting longer than you have." Ethan swallowed hard and pulled the panel wide. Inside was a narrow steel cavity, protected by the angle of the car and the packed clay around it. No gold caught the flashlight beam. No stacks of money. No myth made simple. There was only a wax-wrapped metal case. 4 cylindrical core samples nested in rotted canvas, a leather-bound field journal, and several folded maps sealed in oilskin. Ethan let out a breath he had not known he was holding. Ranger pressed his shoulder against Ethan's arm, warm and real. You found it, Ethan whispered. Then, after a pause, no, he found it. You just made sure I listened. The case bore a stamped label. Marrow and Pick Survey Company, Hydrologic and Unit, 1969. Beneath it, in faded ink, Arthur Vance, lead engineer. Ethan opened the journal first. The pages were fragile but legible, filled with sketches of stratolines, coordinates, rainfall estimates, and notations about an ancient buried channel beneath Sparrow Wash. Phrases rose from the page like voices through static. Subsurface flow confirmed. Clay cap intact. Drilling point must remain south of ridge. Municipal potential significant. Ethan read until the sun and heat and years seemed to fall away. This was not treasure in the way men like Grant understood treasure. It would not glitter in a palm. It would not buy a mansion or put a man's name on a billboard. It was quieter than that. Larger. Water. The word moved through Ethan with the force of a prayer he had not meant to say. Beneath the driest joke in Dry Creek Falls, beneath the rusted monument everyone had mocked, lay evidence of a hidden aquifer that might sustain the town that had forgotten how to believe in anything under its own feet. The core samples matched the notes: pale limestone, dense clay, traces of mineral staining consistent with old groundwater movement. Ethan knew enough to understand what he did not yet know. This needed verification, a hydrologist, modern imaging, legal review. But the possibility was no longer a ghost. It had weight. It had coordinates. It had his father's stubborn fingerprints all over it. Ranger suddenly moved to the side of the compartment and pawed at a second, smaller opening, nearly buried under clay. Ethan cleared it and found an old vent tube lined with fine mesh, still intact, placed to keep the documents dry without letting the compartment rot. He smiled despite himself. Smart, he said. Whoever built this wanted the record to survive. He looked down at Walter's notebook lying open beside the toolbox, then at the map in his hands. For years, Walter had been called foolish for guarding a wreck. But he had not been guarding the past. He had been guarding the future until someone with the right training, the right grief, and the right dog came home to open it. The first thunder came so softly Ethan almost mistook it for a truck passing somewhere beyond the ridge. He was kneeling beside the red spike, sliding Arthur Vance's maps back into the wax-wrapped case, when Ranger lifted his head. The shepherd's ears fixed north. His body went still, every muscle listening. Ethan followed his gaze and saw what the desert had been hiding all afternoon. A dark bruise of cloud, gathering above the far hills, too distant to shade him, close enough to matter. In Arizona, rain did not need to fall where you stood to change the ground beneath your feet. A storm 10 miles away could send a wall of muddy water down a dry wash that had looked harmless an hour before. Ethan knew that. He had taught younger men that very lesson over maps and sand tables. Still, the first fat drops that struck the steel roof of the boxcar felt almost unreal, tapping lightly, politely, as if asking permission to become dangerous. He packed faster, camera, notebook, core samples, Vance's journal, Walter's notes. The proof of 55 years of being wrong about a place lay in one metal case at his feet. Then Ranger barked, not once, 3 times, sharp and urgent toward the service road. Ethan turned. At the lower crossing, a county pickup had stopped near the dip where the road cut across the wash. Martha Bell stood outside it, with a hand raised against the wind, her silver hair whipping loose from its clip. Beside her was a survey technician Ethan had met only that morning, a thin man named Owen Pierce, holding a tripod case and staring at the sky with the pale confusion of someone who had trusted a forecast too much. Water appeared behind them as a brown line at first, sliding over the stones with deceptive grace. Then another surge followed, thicker, faster, carrying branches, dust, and the smell of mountains opening their old wounds. "Martha!" Ethan shouted, but the wind swallowed half her name. Ranger was already moving. He bounded down the slope. Not reckless, not wild, but with the clean purpose of an animal who understood urgency without needing reasons. Ethan grabbed the metal case. For one terrible second, he held the future of Dry Creek Falls in both hands and felt how small it was. Paper, ink, core samples, coordinates, everything Walter had guarded, everything Ethan had come home too late to understand. If he ran straight to the truck, he could save it all. If he went after Martha and Owen, the case might be soaked, crushed, lost, or taken by the very wash it was meant to redeem. Another clap of thunder rolled over Sparrow Wash, closer now, and the water rose around the county pickup's tires. Martha tried to step back, but the road behind her had begun to disappear beneath red runoff. Owen froze beside her, clutching useless equipment. Ethan looked at the case, then at Ranger, who had reached the slope below them and was barking toward a narrow ledge of higher rock. The dog did not look back for permission. That decided it. Ethan ran to the red spike, shoved the case deep into the open survey compartment, wrapped Walter's canvas strap through the inner brace, and pulled it tight with hands that had suddenly stopped shaking. "Stay," he whispered to the evidence absurdly, like it was alive. Then he turned and ran. The wash changed while he crossed it. Dry stone became slick clay. The shallow trickle became a current tugging at his boots. He kept his body low, using the oral ties for balance, calling directions over the roar. Left, up the rock face, don't cross the water. Ranger reached Martha first, planting himself on the ledge above the road, barking until she understood where to climb. Ethan got to Owen, took the tripod case from his stiff hands, and pointed him toward the same rise. No heroics. No grand speech. Just one step, then another. A palm against Martha's elbow when her foot slipped. Ranger braced beside her like a living rail. Owen scrambled up after them, breathless, ashamed, alive. When they reached the high shelf, the first real surge slammed through the crossing below, brown and loud and absolute. It wrapped around the county pickup, lifted one side, then settled it crooked against a boulder, as if the desert had simply moved the road somewhere else. Martha sank to the rock, one hand pressed to her chest. Rain streaked her glasses. She looked at Ethan, then at Ranger, and her face changed in a quiet way that apology alone could not hold. Ethan looked back toward the red spike. Water churned around its buried nose. The open compartment sat just above the flow line, but spray struck the steel in hard bursts. He could not tell if the case had held. He could not tell if Walter's proof was safe. Ranger leaned against his leg, soaked, panting, steady. Ethan laid a wet hand on the dog's head and felt, beneath the fear, something clearer than relief. The maps mattered. The water mattered. The town mattered. But none of it meant anything if, at the first test, he forgot that every piece of it was supposed to serve human lives. By dawn, Sparrow Wash looked innocent again, which somehow made it worse. The flood had vanished into the desert as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind red mud, twisted brush and stones polished clean, as if the night had taken a hard cloth to the world. Ethan returned with Ranger before the county crews came, his boots sinking into the soft clay, his shirt still damp from the storm, his body carrying that hollow ache that comes after fear has finished its work. Martha had offered to come with him, but he had asked her to wait. He did not know whether he wanted a witness if the compartment was empty. Ranger moved ahead through the wash, slower than usual, nose low, pausing at places where the water had changed the ground. The red spike stood where it always had, scarred and stubborn, its rusted side glowing dull orange in the early light. For a moment, Ethan hated it for surviving when the thing inside might not have. Then Ranger climbed to the buried nose, sniffed along the seam, and gave one short bark. Ethan's hands felt clumsy as he opened the survey compartment. Mud streaked the outer plate. Water had sprayed into the edge, but not reached deep. The canvas strap was still tight around the metal case. The waxed wrapping had darkened, but it had held. Ethan closed his eyes and let his forehead rest against the cool steel. He did not say thank God. He did not say Dad. The two feelings were too close together to separate. He only breathed. 2 days later, the case sat on a clean table in the county meeting room under lights, too bright for something that had spent 55 years in the dark. Dr. Helen Brooks from the University of Arizona had driven up from Tucson after Martha sent photographs and coordinates with a subject line that read, "Possible Historic Hydrologic Survey, Urgent." Dr. Brooks was in her 50s, calm-eyed, with sun-browned hands and the direct manner of a woman who trusted data more than volume. She examined the maps, the core samples, the journal, and Ethan's field notes without drama. Grant Harlan attended the meeting too, though no one had invited him to the table. He stood near the wall in his expensive boots, arms folded, wearing the polite impatience of a man waiting for reality to become convenient again. The county board sat in a row. Martha sat beside Ethan. Ranger lay at Ethan's feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed but not sleeping. After nearly an hour, Dr. Brooks removed her glasses and looked around the room. "The original survey was remarkably thorough," she said. "Some terminology is outdated, but the observations are consistent. The core samples show a clay cap over permeable limestone. The mapped channel aligns with modern satellite elevation data. I would not call this a guaranteed municipal solution without imaging and test drilling. But I will say this clearly. Arthur Vance appears to have identified a viable aquifer beneath Sparrow Wash. The room went very still. Not silent, still, as if every person had to set down an old opinion before picking up the new one. Martha's hand found the edge of the table. One board member looked at Ethan, then away. Grant cleared his throat. A resource like that would require private investment. My company could help organize development. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. There was a time, not long ago, when anger might have answered first. But the wash, the flood, and Walter's notebook had changed the order of things inside him. "This doesn't belong to one man's ambition," Ethan said quietly. "Not mine, not yours. If the aquifer is real, it belongs in a public plan, with conservation rules, community access, and Walter Cole's name in the record beside Arthur Vance's." Grant's smile thinned. No one moved to support him. That was the first apology, though nobody said the word. The second came later, outside the Red Spike, when a road crew removed the old spray-painted sign that read Cole Folly from a post near the wash. The third came when an old rancher who had once laughed at Walter stood beside Ethan in the heat and said, with his hat crushed between both hands, "Your father saw what we refused to see." Ethan did not make him suffer for the sentence. He only nodded. Respect, he was learning, was not proved by shame. It was proved by what people did after they understood. By sunset, Martha had filed a preservation request for the wreck site. Dr. Brooks had scheduled ground imaging. The county had agreed to suspend all sale discussions. Ethan stood beside Ranger at the edge of the wash, watching the last light move across the rusted car. For the first time, the Red Spike did not look abandoned. It looked entrusted. And Ethan understood that his father's true inheritance had never been land, steel, or even water. It was the responsibility to look at what others had dismissed and say, gently but firmly, "Look again." 1 year later, the first water rose from the test well at Sparrow Wash just after sunrise, clear and cold enough to fog the glass jar, Doctor. Helen Brooks held beneath the spout. No one cheered at first. The sound was too simple for that. Water striking glass. Water spilling over fingers. Water finding daylight after being hidden longer than most people in Dry Creek Falls had been alive. The whole town seemed to stand inside that sound. Ethan Cole watched from a few yards away with Ranger at his side, one hand resting lightly on the shepherd's head. The dog's muzzle had grown grayer over the year, and the limp he carried on damp mornings had become a little more noticeable. But his eyes were still bright, still alert, still fixed on the world, as if every ordinary thing might contain a mission. Ethan looked different too, though not in any way a mirror could fully explain. The hard lines in his face had not vanished. Grief had not politely packed its bags and left him. But something in him had settled. He no longer looked like a man bracing for impact. He looked like a man willing to stand where he was. The well did not make Dry Creek Falls rich. It did not turn the desert into a garden overnight or erase years of hard weather, bad planning, and stubborn pride. What it did was humbler, and maybe holier. It gave the volunteer fire station a protected reserve. It gave small ranches enough confidence to plant again in measured rows. It gave the clinic, the diner, the old houses along Cottonwood Street, and the people who had nearly forgotten the taste of relief a reason to believe survival did not have to mean leaving. The county built a modest pump house, not fancy, not loud, with a plaque near the door that read, "Walter Cole and Arthur Vance Community Water Site." Below that, in smaller letters, it said, "Preserved through the work of Ethan Cole and Ranger." Ethan had argued against his own name being included. Martha Bell had ignored him with the serene authority of a woman who had spent her life correcting public records and private nonsense. The Red Spike remained where it had always been, but not as it had been. Engineers reinforced the unstable sections, cleared the debris, and built a safe walking path along the ridge. The graffiti was not scrubbed away completely. Ethan asked them to leave a few faded patches beneath protective glass, not to honor mockery, but to remember it. "People should see what we called it before we understood it," he told the board. Near the overlook stood a second plaque, plain bronze against red stone. "Some things are not worthless. They are waiting for someone patient enough to understand them." On the morning of the dedication, Dry Creek Falls gathered without the restless hunger of gossip. Men who had once laughed at Walter stood quietly with hats in hand. Women from the diner brought coffee and peach pies. The road crew leaned against their trucks, sunburned and sheepish. Grant Harlan did not come, though a formal letter from his office had arrived weeks earlier, cleanly worded and empty of warmth. Ethan did not mind. Not every apology needed an audience, and not every absence needed to be chased. Martha spoke first, then Dr. Brooks, then a county commissioner who had learned, with visible discomfort, how to pronounce humility in public. Ethan was asked to say a few words. He stepped up with Ranger beside him, the desert wind moving gently through the dry grass below. For a moment he saw Walter everywhere, in the toolbox resting on the display table, in the old survey maps preserved behind glass, in the shadow of the boxcar, in the water line cutting a new path toward town. "My father wasn't a man who explained himself easily," Ethan said. His voice came out rougher than he expected, but he did not hide it. "A lot of people mistook that for foolishness. Sometimes I did too." He paused, his hand finding Ranger's collar. "But he believed a person or a place could hold value even when no one clapped for it, even when no one understood. Maybe respect starts there. Not when something proves useful to us, but before that. When we choose not to laugh at what we haven't taken time to understand." No one moved for a few seconds after he finished. Then Martha wiped her eyes with the corner of the program and began clapping softly. Once, then again. Others joined. Ethan looked down at Ranger, who only yawned, unimpressed by ceremony, and leaned against his leg. That evening, after the crowd had gone, Ethan stayed at the overlook until the sky turned violet over the red hills. The well pump clicked on in the distance, steady as a heartbeat. The red spike caught the last light and glowed, no longer like a wound, not quite like a monument, but like a promise that had survived embarrassment, weather, and time. Ethan crouched beside Ranger and placed his palm on the warm earth. For years he had thought coming home meant returning to a place that knew all his failures. Now he understood it differently. Coming home meant accepting the unfinished work of love. It meant listening to the quiet things. It meant looking again. Ranger lifted one paw and set it gently near Ethan's hand, as if signing the land with him. Ethan smiled. "You were right, boy," he whispered. "He left us water." Then, after a long breath, he added, "and a way back. If this story touched you, give it a like and subscribe for more stories about loyalty, healing, and the quiet miracles we almost overlook. Tell us which moment stayed with you the most, and where you're watching from today."